Good day, audience. You join me for the second recording of this video because I accidentally deleted the first. So there's that for you. On the 30th of October, I had the pleasure of attending the Saving Species Conference hosted by Conservation Chat UK at the University Centre of South Devon College. For those of you who weren't able to attend, or for those of you who are simply interested on the topics that we covered, I will hopefully do my best to encapsulate them for you in this video. To save yourself a little bit of time, and if you don't want to watch me rambling for the entire however long this video is going to be, I will put timestamps down below in the description, as well as any helpful information like numbers, web addresses, that sort of thing, for your convenience. Full disclaimer, just because my memory is god-awful, I do have notes here to the side that I will be reading from, so it's not that I don't want to look at you, it's just my memory's not that good, so I need assistance. So grab yourself a beverage and let's jump right in. The conference began with my old tutor Stuart Collier giving us an insight into the Living Planet report. According to this report, since 1970, we've had a 73% decline in species. Just to put an emphasis on this for you, we've had an 85% reduction in freshwater species, 56% reduction in marine species, and 63% reduction in terrestrial species. And if we break this down by region, that's a 39% reduction across North America, a 95% reduction across Latin America and the Caribbean, 35% across Europe and Central Asia, 60% across Asia and the Pacific, and 76% in Africa. Now, of course, the threats will vary between region and environments. However, things like climate change, pollution, overexploitation of resources, and just general human impacts, surprise, surprise, are the main ones across the board. However, to keep it all from being doom and gloom, there is hope as far as the rejuvenation of habitat and the saving of species is concerned. We have renewable energies, better farming practices, and just generally more public awareness and encouraging the public to change their behaviours as far as their food consumption and daily living is concerned. Implementing protected areas such as marine protected areas and national parks to preserve the species that reside within them. And with that comes rewilding, so taking areas which were otherwise occupied by humans and giving it back to nature. And of course, giving the environment an economic worth. Given the recent economic crisis, you don't want to hit people's pockets, but needless to say, if we don't do our best to fix the environment that we all share and reside in and rely on for things like food, then money's going to be the least of our concerns moving forward. Next, we had Alicia Lancaster, who looked at the effects of auditory enrichment on the golden-headed lion tamarins in Sholden Zoo. Why is this important? Well, auditory enrichment isn't something that's widely researched in captivity. If we're going to be keeping animals in captivity, then the idea is that we're going to want to promote their welfare as much as possible, which includes looking at everything from the diet of these animals all the way to environmental stimulus, the design of their enclosure, those kind of things. Optimizing them as much as possible for the sake of the animal. Much like you and me, if there is a noise within our environment that we're not particularly keen on, we're going to do our best to try and move away from it or remove it in whatever way we can. It can be easy to see how this can also impact animals within our care, so it's up to us as their guardians to ensure that these stimulus aren't causing them any problems. The audio in this particular experiment was broken down into 3 categories and 2 concepts. The 3 categories included environmental, native species, and man-made sounds, of which were then broken down individually into 2 separate concepts, both novel and known. These sounds were then played to the golden-headed lion tamarins, and their behaviours were closely monitored. 2 key results were identified in this experiment. The first being that the sound of a macaw seemed to increase food consumption. The first being that their food may get stolen by the macaw if they're present within the area, so they're going to want to consume as much of it as possible, just to ensure that he doesn't get too much of a look in. However, it's believed the second and most likely reason is that the presence of other species like a macaw means that there's likely to be food nearby that the golden-headed lion tamarins could get a look in at. The second result revealed that novel sounds, or unknown sounds like the sound of a waterfall, caused the greatest range of behaviours to be displayed. This broad range of behaviour display may well be just the animal simply processing and doing their best to understand and adapt to the sound of this novel sound. I love coffee. Next, we had Cam Molland, who gave us a rather interesting insight into the power of whale poo. Namely, could whale poo be a key driver in solving the climate crisis? He brought up the concept of the whale pump, which in very basic terms goes something like this. Whales will dive down into the ocean and consume things like krill and fish. After they've consumed quite a lot of food, like any organism such as you and I, they will eventually need to pass this out through waste. Whales will then come up to the surface to breathe and let go of said waste, which is said to be 10 times more nutrient dense than the seawater itself. What this waste then does, it feeds an organism known as phytoplankton. This organism is photosynthetic, meaning that it will take in carbon dioxide as part of the photosynthetic cycle. Phytoplankton are consumed by things like copepods. Copepods are then consumed by things like krill by fish, and then fish, and the krill, I suppose, by the whales. This whale poo is then reconsumed by the phytoplankton, essentially creating a very important ecological cycle. Not only that, but by feeding the phytoplankton, you're also supporting their population growth. And here's where it gets important, because 1% increase in the phytoplankton population is the equivalent carbon sequestration of 30 billion mature trees. They say there isn't always a singular solution to a problem, but I don't know, man. This is pretty close. My microphone's died, so if there is a sudden change in the audio quality, you now know why, and I can only apologise. Next, we had Paul Cox, who is the CEO of the Shark Trust. He gave us an insight into the current state of the shark, ray and chimera populations. As a result of predominantly overfishing, 1/3 of all shark species are currently threatened with extinction. And of sharks, rays and chimeras, we have one extinct species, which is a ray species. 93 are critically endangered, 129 are endangered, 179 are vulnerable, 130 are near threatened, 546 are least concern, and 175 are data deficient, simply meaning that there isn't enough information to get an accurate assessment on the current state of their populations. For all we know, 60 of those could be critically endangered. We just don't know. Of course, besides overfishing, things like water pollution, microplastics, overfishing, namely bycatch, and unfortunately in certain cases directly targeting the sharks, rays and chimeras themselves, oil spills, loss of habitat and lack of nesting sites are also part of that grim list. Encouraging better fishing practices, implementing and enforcing laws that prevent fishing in certain areas where these sharks may reside or breed, banning the use of certain things like gill nets, for example, encouraging consumer awareness and for consumers like you and I to make better choices with regards to things like plastics and the fish that we purchase, implementing marine protected areas so these species have a chance to recover, and of course monitoring the habitats at which these species reside and closely monitoring numbers to ensure that they at the very least remain stable. Next, we had Sue Sayer, who gave us a marvellous talk about our native seals, which include the common and the grey seal. 2023 key data revealed 4,567 surveys were conducted, which is essentially 13 a day. 11,409 IDs were made in that time. 81 unique entanglements were recorded, and 155 events of disturbances were also recorded in this time. The talk shed light on the distribution of this species, where they're moving to, their breeding habits, as well as the things that are currently threatening them. There was a particular emphasis on human disturbances. Seals are marine mammals, and bless them, their bodies are mainly designed for swimming in the aquatic environment, and they tend to be a little less graceful on land. So much so that getting onto land, which is often quite treacherous and rocky, takes an awful lot of energy. They go on land to reproduce, look after pups, and of course rest. However, unfortunately, when people come along and see the seals and the seals see them, they are then disturbed. Seals then end up panicking and making their way to the water as quickly as possible to get away from the perceived threat. This in turn causes severe injury like broken bones, namely the jaw and ribs, which can be life-threatening, gashes to the body, and in unfortunate cases, the abandonment of pups. Not only that, but because they've expended so much energy getting onto land in the first place, they then have to expend more energy, which they don't really have, getting back into the water. If we then look at the ribs, because of the pressure underwater, when they breathe in and out, the ribs will heal, then break again, heal, then break again, which ultimately means recovery from these injuries takes an awful long time. As far as disturbances, it comes from things like swimmers, kayakers, and tour boats, just to name a few. Just to put human disturbances in perspective for you, between the years of 2019 and 2021, 4 hotspots as far as spotting seals is concerned were analysed. People were present 65% of the time, and of that time, disturbances occurred 68% of the time. The way in which we can all help is, of course, admiring these animals at a distance. Your priority should be to ensure that they haven't seen you and you stay at least 100 metres away from them. Now, you may be familiar with sniffer dogs in the police force and in airports, but what about being used for conservation? The next talk from Willow West gave us an insight into this reality. When it comes to the analysis of an environment to determine whether a species is present or not, me and you can only do so much. Where dogs are useful in this endeavour is their senses are, of course, far more refined than yours and mine. Many things that you and I may miss in the environment, the dogs are able to pick up on. Examples include droppings left by voles and scent left by things like the greater crested newt. And of course, dogs generally don't have a bias unless you're my dog and you have a preference for my partner, despite me looking after you your entire life. Thanks, buddy. When it comes to sniffer dogs, they're either going to find evidence or they're not. There's no second guessing or grey area, which you and I may be subjected to. Training is focused on making it as enjoyable as possible for the animal, and it's often tailored to the behaviour and the personality of that particular dog. They aim to build confidence and determination in the dog because they're often traversing sometimes quite harsh terrain, if you think about moorlands, for example. And of course, trainers aim to manage the frustration of these dogs because if they're going out to find an animal and they don't find it, it can be quite disappointing for them. It's also important to mention that when it comes to being in harsh environments, these dogs are also given risk assessments and the necessary equipment to keep them safe. Now, you may be wondering what dogs suit being conservation sniffer dogs. Well, surprisingly, it's actually those that tend to be quite hyperactive and, I want to say, misbehaved, just for the sake of argument, but basically, any dog that is too well trained tends to be more focused on their trainer than they are the actual animal that they're searching for. And it goes without saying that a dog possessing a quite strong prey mentality is obviously not going to be suitable. That's why you'll often find when it comes to sniffer dogs that they are going to be on the end of a lead when it comes to searching for animals out in the wild. Although they may not necessarily attack the animal in question, they may end up potentially spoiling any evidence that might be present. Now, you may be wondering as well, where does the source odour used for training the dog come from? In many instances, like our shrew example, droppings can be used as a scent marker to train the dog with. Or in the case of the greater crested newt, for example, having live specimens may be required. In this particular case, you would need specialist knowledge of the animal's care and a licence, which long and the short means tracking certain animal species is going to be easier for certain dog handlers compared to others. Then we had Zach Showell, who's director of the Sheldon Wildlife Trust. Sheldon is a zoological collection that demonstrates that you don't need to be a large zoo to do an awful lot for conservation. In this particular example, we looked at the Alston civet. The Alston civet comes from Vietnam, with small pockets being found in surrounding countries. The primary threats they face include illegal hunting via the use of snares, which go into the bushmeat trade, as well as habitat fragmentation. Operation Save Our Civet is predominantly focused on enhancing the captive breeding efforts of this particular species. Thrigby Hall Wildlife Gardens, Newquay Zoo and Sheldon Wildlife Trust, of course, are the predominant players in this breeding project ex situ of Vietnam. If you're particularly interested in this project, then I will put the relevant information in the description because it is quite a hefty read and there's a lot of information that goes into it. Efforts of the programme also include improved dietary design, enclosure design and weight management. Its predominant goal is to improve ex situ breeding efforts. In very basic terms, this also includes taking fecal samples in order to understand the reproductive cycle of this species. Both Zach Showell himself and the European Association of Zoos and Aquaria, or EAZA, play an important part in maintaining the genetic diversity of ex situ populations. By collaborating and sharing key information on dietary habits and breeding as well as conservation protocols, this species may well have a chance to recover in the future, with the end goal being to reintroduce captive individuals back into the wild. It's an exceptionally important subject and quite a hefty one, and I simply can't do it justice in one video, so like I said, I'll put all the relevant information that I can find below in the description for you if you're particularly interested in learning more. Next, we had Carla Dunn, who gave us a very insightful and important talk on bat first aid. In the UK, we have 18 species of native bat, 17 of which choose to breed here. Now, why is this particularly important? Well, of course, looking after our native wildlife and just wildlife in general is essentially important, but any skills that we can utilise to better help these species in a practical sense is also quite important. Speaking of which, how do you know if a bat may well need your help? If you see a bat out during the daytime, if you find a pup without its mother, and pups generally tend to be a lot smaller and more grey in coloration than typical dark brown or black that you see most bats possess, are they quite close to the public or out in a public area? And of course, are there any obvious injuries that you can see on the bat itself caused by cats being struck by a vehicle, that sort of thing? Now, I should make it clear that bats are protected species and they require quite specialist care. So similar to the great crested newt and the dormouse, you do need a license to handle them long term. But that doesn't mean that you can't help on a base level. It is advised that you use a cloth, tea towel or some soft gloves to scoop up the bat from where you find it. Get yourself a Tupperware and put fine holes in the top. And when I say small, I must emphasize small because these guys can be escape artists. Placing a clean cloth or tea towel into the Tupperware with a bottle cap full of water is enough to keep them safe and stabilized. Once the bat is secure, it's important that you leave them in a quiet, darkened area and get in contact with your local helpline, of which I will put down in the description for you. And lastly, we had Lorna Welch from the Butterfly Conservation Trust, asking the essential question, where have the butterflies gone? And moths as well, of course, they're both very important. Much like bees and bats, for example, moths and butterflies are essential pollinators. Without species like this, we would be in quite big trouble. Needless to say, these species are very important, not only for our ecosystem, but for our survival. Climate change, pollutants, and bad farming practices are their main threats. When I say bad farming practices, I mean those that use quite harsh chemicals on their crops, which in turn has an indirect and direct impact on both moths and butterflies. Data from the big butterfly count between 2021 and 2023, which of course I will also put down in the description for you, suggests that butterflies and moths are ultimately on the decline. Now, because there are more participants in the big butterfly count each year, at a glance it looks like butterfly numbers are increasing. However, it just simply means more are being measured each year, but ultimately if you scale back and look at it, these species are ultimately still in trouble. However, although it can sometimes skew the results, it is still ultimately a good thing. The more people that participate in these counts, the more data we have and the better analysis that we can perform on butterfly and moth populations, which ultimately means that we can better measure the impact of conservation efforts. By joining the big butterfly count, volunteering with the Butterfly Conservation Trust, and of course creating wildlife friendly areas, we can ultimately help bolster the population of these species. In a nutshell, that was the Saving Species Conference 2024. Now, before you run away, there's just one last piece of information I need to throw at you. Inspiring and educating the next generation about wildlife is incredibly important for the future of our planet. So if you are a parent or know young people, I suppose, then you may be interested in an event that Conservation Chat will be holding in 2025. The Kids Conservation Club is a series of talks hosted by Conservation Chat UK aimed at inspiring and educating young minds about wildlife. They will be held remotely and they will be free of charge. Now, I need to put out a disclaimer that any young individuals attending these remote talks will need an adult or guardian supervising them during. Now, by all means, if you have any questions with regards to any of the topics that were covered, feel free to drop them below down in the comments. If you liked this kind of content, I'm hoping to do many more. So by all means, click the like button, feel free to subscribe, and yeah, I'll see you next time.